Hey, I'm Felissa Rose, and you're watching Keto and Crime.
What you're looking at is some of the final footage of Jonestown, Guyana, taken in 1978 that was part of a recent Today Show documentary. What's really sad is that before this year was up, most of these people would be dead and the others would be fleed and scattered into the jungle, just trying to find their way out. But Jonestown did not start here. In part one of our expose, we studied the beginnings of Jim Jones, A Madman Rises, and learned all about his childhood and things that should have been warning signs of what was to come. But unfortunately, as so many things go, they weren't. So today, we venture into his years in the Midwest in Indiana, and then to a brief stint in Central and South America, and eventually back to the Midwest before he took off for California and eventually Jonestown, Guyana. And with that being said, let's get into a Keto and Crime Classic, Part 2 of our expose on Jim Jones and the People's Temple. With that being said, here is 2020 Tracy, with quarantine hair still, telling you about the People's Temple and Jim Jones, the Indiana and Central South America years. Let's do it. Welcome back to Thought Crime and Keto and Crime. We are back with part 2 of Jim Jones and the People's Temple. We're in the rise of the People's Temple, the Indiana years. So let's get into it. If you remember from last time, Jim and Marcelin's marriage kind of having some problems. They attempted to adopt a nephew of Marcelin who wanted no part of it. We really saw that Jim's manipulation and use of emotional torment was starting to get more and more being a thing. We also see that he's not exactly stable. He's not above trying to hurt people, what with trying to sabotage the Baldwin's car, we think. And he also, instead of just street preaching in an interdenominational fashion, he's decided that he can now go back to a more mainstream denomination like Protestantism because of their social creed. And that's where we pick up with him trying to become ordained as a Methodist minister. So he started again street preaching around Indianapolis. He went back to his old Pentecostal roots because he realized that that's the way you stir energy. That's the way you stir a crowd. Also, Pentecostalism tends to be more accepted in an African-American community than in, your basic middle-class whites. It tends to be more of a working class or poor white, working class African American or poor African American thing than an upper middle than a middle class, upper middle class, or a wealthy person of any color. It tends to be more accepted because it believes in miracles and healings and you asking for something and receiving it. That tends to be more of a thing with working class or poor people. So he realized that he could catch a lot more of the types of people he wanted because he really did believe in social justice. I said it earlier when I first started this, that if you could cut the story of the People's Temple off before the suicide, or if there hadn't been a suicide, we would be praising Jim Jones today because of his integration work in the city of Indianapolis and in the northern part of California. We would be praising him today because of the strides he made for civil rights, but it went a different way. So he really did do some good things. He decided to concentrate his ministry toward poor neighborhoods, which meant mostly black people in Indianapolis. And so he started street preaching, and he created quite a following. And he decided that he was going to start his own little church. So he rented a community center. He made it interdenominational, even though he was trying to get an in with the Methodist Church. He rented a community center. He started a little daycare center. And he, had Marcelin and he would watch kids for people during the day. They would also have church and church services and youth services. and everything that you want in a little bitty church in one of the poorer neighborhoods of Indianapolis. So he also went back to the things he learned at the Gospel Tabernacle all the way back in Lynn. He would speak in tongues during services, even though he didn't believe it. He would literally fake it. He's been known to do that. He said it's right. He would to do that. He also went back to healing. Healing was something that he had seen in the Gospel Tabernacle and learned from being groomed as a child preacher exactly what went into it. So he would talk to people before the service, and then during the service, if they had told him they had aches or pains or whatever, he would learn that information prior, and then during the service, he would call people out, and people would say, you know, Fred, you have painful knees, and you know, Fred would be like, yes, I have painful knees. Well, you're going to get a healing today, and he would point his hands, and
Now with each of you, a fond embrace, a salutary kiss of greeting to your neighbor. Let's fill this atmosphere with warmth. Edie? Are your fingers numb? In your right hand? Having enormous headaches in your head?
Yes.
Reach your hands out. Reach your hand out to me. Reach the fingers out that are bothering you. Now, is the pain gone?
He would get people so hyped up, and then he could touch them and they would fall backwards. He learned this from going to the Gospel Tabernacle, and he discovered that healings like that and getting people hyped up so that they would literally do anything that he wanted them to do would build his ministry. And so he started doing that, and people started coming to his little church for the healing ceremonies. He also started giving people diseases so that he could heal them. He would literally tell somebody, sister, you have cancer, and I'm healing you of it, and God is healing you of it right now. So he would literally like give people an illness so that he could heal them. I mean, any trick you can think of. In 1953, he went to a Detroit church convention where he watched another minister actually kind of do the same thing he had been doing and get the crowd really hyped up. Not only was this minister calling out names, he was also calling out phone numbers and other personally identifiable information, which probably should never have been done, and basically tricking people into thinking they were healed. So he decided, I can do this too. So he started going around and getting names from the people at the service and talking to them. And then he took the pulpit. He wasn't even on the lineup, but he took the pulpit, and basically, if you've ever heard Jim Jones speak, he was a great speaker. He studied the speeches of Stalin and Winston Churchill and Hitler. I mean, think what you want to about anybody like Hitler or Stalin, but they were great orators. They were great speakers. And Jim Jones studied that stuff, and he lit that convention on fire. There were people singing his praises for weeks afterwards. In fact, he angered the organizers of it because he kind of took the thunder away from the headlining preacher, so to speak. And I think it's so funny as a comedian, as a stand-up comedian. You have headliners, you have features and openers, and then hosts. There's a hierarchy, and you got the same thing with these preachers, which leads me to believe and know that it's just, it's just a good performance. Yeah, I find that very funny. But he outshined the headlining preacher, and it really made people mad. So he learned at that conference more tricks to the trade. He took those back to Indianapolis, and he built up a tremendous following at that little rented church. He developed such a following in Indianapolis that he started kind of going church to church, being a guest pastor, a guest speaker, an evangelist. And would build followings at other pastors' churches and then just kind of peel them off. One thing he did do during this time, and I've always thought this was one of the most hilarious things about Jim Jones, he actually became a monkey salesman. Capuchin monkeys, just like the one that he had trained to terrorize Ronnie. He was actually had gotten into a pet store that was going bankrupt and was actually helping the pet store owner by selling these monkeys. And he would take part of it, the pet store owner would take part of it, and it would also give Jim Jones the opportunity to get into people's homes with these monkeys and talk to them and perhaps get them over for his church. So he started calling this his monkey business pitch, and I think it's one of the most hilarious things about him. He was full of monkey shit, and he was selling monkey shit, so it really was just fitting. One of his longtime temple members, a woman by the name of 𝗍𝗿𝗄𝐻, that's how she came into the temple. She had a monkey that hung itself. Now, I don't know if the monkey just had that miserable life that did it on purpose, or he just got hung up in something and hung himself. Now, sideline, I had pet ducks growing up. I lived in a farm area. One of my ducks hung itself. It got its neck caught in between like the rafters of a pen, and it actually hung itself. So it could have been something like that, or this monkey might just have had that bad of a life. But he kind of roped 𝗍𝗿𝗄𝐻 into the church by selling her a replacement monkey for the one that killed itself. Also, from the community church, he and Marcelin actually adopted a young girl named Agnes who had a very bad home life, and she also had a severe speech impediment. She stuttered a whole lot, and they took her in and actually legally adopted her. It was their first child. So Marcelin was thrilled. She now had a daughter, and they actually helped her overcome her stutter. So Agnes is now in the mix, and they're not this nice little nuclear family that he so adores. He started, he was still going around churches doing his healings. He also was starting to bring other church members like 𝗍𝗿𝗄𝐻 into it. 𝗍𝗿𝗄𝐻 would dress up and pretend to be crippled or pretend to be, have pain, and allow Jim Jones to heal her in front of church services. So that would help him get more members. He also started using things like chicken livers and chicken hearts and animal innards to be tumors. So he would literally tell like a plant in the audience, you have cancer, and God is telling me that you need to go to the restroom right now. And the person would go to the restroom and then come out holding this bloody, gluttonous blob of stuff. And Jim Jones would take it and say it was the tumor. It had come out. Stay away. Don't look at it. Didn't want them to realize it was a chicken liver. He would also sometimes have people come up and he would pretend to heal them of cancer. He would take his hands away, and then there would be another gelatinous blob that he would claim was a tumor. So he was really getting into some fakery. In fact, these same techniques were used by faith healers all over. In fact, Peter Popoff, he was exposed by James Randi for doing the exact same things. You can find lots of stuff on YouTube, hear about it. I actually also did a video on Jim Bakker and faith healers, and I'll put that up here if you'd like to see it. But a lot of trickery in that realm. But he did find kind of a semi-regular church home at Laurel Street Methodist Church. He started preaching there semi-regularly. The pastor was an older pastor that was about to retire, and he really felt that he could make that church his own because he started bringing other people in and really pump up the services. But there was kind of a problem there. It was a fully white church, and a lot of Jim Jones followers were black, and Laurel Street Methodist wasn't really ready for integration. So that ended up being a problem, and then they did not hire Jim Jones after their elderly pastor retired, and Jim Jones basically said, okay. He left Laurel Street and took probably half of the congregation with him. He not only took out the people that had come with him, he actually took about half of the other population of the other congregation too. So a lot of whites and blacks left Laurel Street Methodist and followed Jim Jones back over to his little rented church. He did finally, with all the offerings and stuff from his followers, and you also had a lot of elderly people in his church that were doing things like deeding him their homes and giving them part of their Social Security checks in exchange for taking care of them. So he had money now, and he actually put a down payment on an actual very nice church in a poorer mixed neighborhood. So that became the Wings of Deliverance Ministries, which would eventually change the name to the People's Temple. And that is where Jim Jones actually started the People's Temple and made a reputation for himself. He continued on with the fake healings, but he also started dibble-dabbling in spiritualism too. He actually went to a New Age conference in 1954 where he did his act, and the people there bought it and deemed him clairvoyant. So he started pulling in people that were kind of hippie and into New Age stuff as well. So he got into healing crystals and stuff like that, as well as traditional Pentecostal Christianity, and actually started integrating a lot of that into his sermons. He also started to build his inner 100, as they're called. Now, there's two different circles in Jim Jones' life. There was the inner 100. These were the original temple members that he was very close to. They were a very mixed bag. And then there's also something called the Planning Commission, which would come later. And this was literally 7 to 8 women that were the closest to Jim Jones for various reasons. And that would come later in California, in San Francisco. But here he started to build the original, what I like to call the inner 100. Among it were, of course, 𝗏𝗏 who would often play, getting healed for him, one of his first original members. You had a mother and daughter by the name of Loretta and Mabel Stewart that were one of the earlies. They would also play plants in the audience. You had 𝗏𝗏, who was a maintenance guy for a pharmaceutical company in town that would actually become one of his associate ministers. And 𝗏𝗏 kind of brought some levity to the church. He was kind of a jovial kind of person, and his sermons were always funny, whereas Jim Jones were kind of, whippy-dippy and intense and things like that. 𝗏𝗏 brought kind of a joker and jesters kind of comedy to the People's Temple, and so he was a very beloved associate pastor. You also had Russell Winberg, who was actually an associate pastor back at Laurel Street, who didn't agree with the segregation of the church. So he and his wife Wilma, who became a church organist and helps with some of the social outreach, actually came over and became another associate pastor. And then you had a woman named Edith Parks, who he actually met from the clairvoyant New Age community, who was kind of a spiritualist, that became another very close associate. Jones decided it was time to go big league, so he put together his own religious church conference. It took place June 11th to June 15th, 1956. Jim Jones was on the list, but he wanted a much bigger evangelist than him to draw people from all over. He didn't just want people from Indianapolis. He wanted to bring people over from Missouri and Kentucky and Tennessee and, all the states surrounding Indiana. He really wanted to bring people over. So he had to get a really well-known evangelist. And that choice was William Brannan.
Crash of some sort. It's an accident.
Yes.
And it was a car wreck.
Yes.
And you were thrown in the air like that.
Yes.
And it strained you in somewhere in your neck and it's caused a cancer to come into your neck. And you're some sort of a teach in the Scripture. And you believe that Jesus Christ makes you well?
I do.
Father God, in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ, on the authority of God's Word by a dying woman, I ask this evil thing to leave her. Satan, you are exposed. So come out of the woman as the Church of the Living God calls for you to leave in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you.
Now, Sister, just a moment. I just want to talk to you. Of course, you know it's gone now.
Oh, yes.
It'll stay that way. See how your throat left?
Oh, yes. Praise the
It's
Lord.
all gone from her. The garter has left her throat, and she. God bless you. Go on your road now and be thankful, happy and rejoice, and be. I adjure thee to leave the child. Come from it. You believe you're going to get well now. God bless you. Turn around, wave to the audience. God bless you. The little girl with tremendous faith. Be well. God bless you, honey. Go. You're right, ill. Do you believe me as his prophet?
He actually was one of the earlier, very popular evangelists. He almost took on a deified status among his congregants. He was he was from Texas and also had churches that followed him in Arkansas and Arizona, all over the place. They were actually called the Brahminites. They actually considered him on par with Jesus. That's how big this evangelist was. And he was an old-timey Southern Pentecostal preacher. And I actually found out about him for the first time by reading Jerry DeWitt, who was a Pentecostal preacher, now atheist advocate, atheist activist. And he actually almost became a Branhamite. He actually studied and realized they were a lot more about Brother Branham than they were about Jesus, and kind of backed out when he was still in the faith. And so this is the person that Jim Jones made the headliner of his conference, and it worked. You had Jim Jones, which was very popular with African Americans, and then you had William Branham, who was very popular with whites of all social levels, coming to his little church for a 4-day thing, and you had Jim Jones doing almost as well as Branham. So you really had the People's Temple coming forward to the limelight. And he said that Branham used the same kind of techniques as he did, getting information prior, except Branham had a staff to do it. And this is when Jim Jones started using church members to feed him information. So his healings got even better. His healings and his interpretations and things like that got even better. He also was amazed that Brother Branham could actually work the crowd up into such a frenzy that he could literally throw his hand out over and everybody in the audience would fall. That's how hyped up, how much of a group psychosis that this man could get over people. And Jim Jones studied him and learned a lot. So now you had even more people crowding into this little church. You have temple membership swelling to, 600-700 people now. You also had them still doing a child care outreach. You had them taking care of elderly people. They actually started taking elderly people that had no family into their own home and taking care of them, and then they would write over their Social Security checks. And so you had them starting what would become a very profitable business for the People's Temple. Later on, they would own up to 4 different nursing homes that would be actually run by Marcelin and Marcelin's parents. That would actually become a profitable thing for the People's Temple and a good civil service. I'm not going to say that Jim Jones didn't do good things. He did a lot of good things. Okay, from that church conference, he met 𝗟̱cy 𝗍𝐼𝐼𝐿, who was a very well-known Black social outreach advocate. He was well known in Black circles in Indiana. He actually helped Jones get a local early talk radio show that he would do. Imes was listening to that show as well, and he started actually, after meeting Jones at the temple conference, he started bringing his family to services at the People's Temple, and helped Jones not only help build his radio audience, but became an important kind of leader for the Black parishioners. Also, he convinced Jones that it was time that the little clapboard church they were kind of outgrowing it, so they actually bought a former Jewish synagogue right in downtown Indianapolis. and that became the new People's Temple. And as a result, for all the things that 𝗟𝐿𝐼𝐼𝐿 had done, he made him an associate pastor, and 𝗟𝐿𝐼𝐼𝐿 would be literally the only black person in the hierarchy of the People's Temple ever. There'll actually be some strife about that later on, but as much as Jim Jones preached equality and desegregation, you will find that even in the People's Temple, the higher echelons tended to be white, whereas the rank and file tended to be black. So it's all the same, isn't it? The 𝗖𝐼𝐼𝐿's, one thing that 𝗟̱cie and his wife did, they started a diner, which pretty much fed people that were hungry. They didn't charge for any of the food. The church, the temple, joined in and started helping kind of finance this thing where they would feed people in the community every single day. They also started expanding the nursing home out of their home. They actually purchased some buildings and started those nursing homes that I talked about, where the elderly people would actually write their Social Security checks over to the People's Temple, and then they would live in these nursing homes and get really good care. 𝗟̱cie started out doing it out of her home, and then they bought 2 other buildings and moved it there. They had, 50 or 60 seniors that lived there, and she actually brought in her parents, the Baldwins, to help Walter and Charlotte to help with that. So this actually started turning a profit. They actually got signed on to, Medicare, major insurance, and they actually started turning a profit off these nursing homes. In the meantime, 𝗟̱cie is also taking care of their daughter Agnes. Remember her? And local black newspapers started endorsing Jim Jones and the People's Temple, so their popularity among the poor of Indianapolis increased, and the membership swelled to about 1,000 people there in Indianapolis. Meanwhile, Jim Jones said the church was family and that everybody was welcome everywhere, and as a result, you started having people that didn't have a home or had a bad home life. Jim would kind of take them in as strays, just like he did animals as a kid. So he had, at any one time, they could have 3 church members living with them in their house, as well as Marceline, their adopted daughter Agnes, her parents for a while until they actually found a place to live, and Lynetta, Jim's mother, also moved in. So you had Marceline under a tremendous amount of stress with a full house, as well as helping to run the nursing home division of the People's Temple, and bad feelings between Marceline and Jim continued to grow, as you can imagine. Also, Jim started, he rented a Greyhound bus and started crisscrossing Indiana and Ohio. He would put on little tent revivals and try to pull people in, new members. So you had a lot of people that would actually become so engulfed with him, they would send money, they would listen to his radio program, some even moved to Indianapolis. So he was really starting to grow with these kind of short-run tent revival sort of things. He also started suffering even more from insomnia, night terrors, and started taking barbiturates or, downers so that he could rest. And that would become a lifelong problem for Jim Jones. Finally, 1957, he journeyed to Philadelphia to meet with a man known as Father Divine. Father Divine was the starter of a social movement that started. He was actually the child of grew up as George Baker, and a sharecropper in either Georgia or Maryland. No one's really sure. But he ended up starting a social outreach in Harlem, New York. And it was much like Jim Jones wanted the People's Temple to be. He would basically ask his followers, Father Divine claimed to be God himself, God incarnate, and he would ask his followers to will or give all their worldly possessions, their paychecks, their homes, everything they had to him, and he would in turn take care of them. So he had purchased a lot of hotels and things like that in Harlem, and his church members would live there, fully taken care of by Father Divine, based on a socialistic, communistic type where everybody's income was everybody's income. And at the height, it was taking in $10,000 a week. Now, this was in, the early 20s, early 30s, so it was a pretty wealthy movement. And Father Divine and his wife, Mother Divine, lived in a lot more luxurious standards than their people. But After the Harlem riots of 1935, they got involved with an actual Communist Party, the Communist Party of the United States. They got into a kind of a war of words with them, and the movement turned almost violent in a way. There were a lot of riots, a lot of protests, and they were kind of chased out of New York, but they set up residence in Philadelphia. Same thing, he bought hotels where his members lived. He had a huge mansion on the outskirts of Philadelphia, and this is where Jones actually met him. Among Father Divine's doctrine was a doctrine of celibacy. He believed that the world was definitely overpopulated. He claimed to be a communistic capitalist, which I find that just... He believed that you should make as much money as possible, but that should go for the common good, I guess. But when I say common good, it means mostly to him and a little bit for his followers. He took care of all of his followers' needs. He encouraged celibacy because he believed the world was overpopulated. He also believed that if you were a member of his flock, that everything belonged to him. So you had no right, you had absolutely no rights to anything outside of the church. So he is the one that turned Jim Jones on to not only a doctrine of celibacy, but also a doctrine of complete surrender, because Jones was having some financial problems, even with the nursing homes and everything. You know, the profits from the nursing homes were more than eaten up by the feeding the hungry, and he was asking Father Divine, how do I do that? He says, well, you can't do that on just the normal tithe that people would give you. So you have to ask for everything. So he told him, basically, ask them for their entire paycheck, and then in the turn you would take care of them. And slowly, that's what Jim Jones started to do. Incidentally, Father Divine had 2 wives. His first was Penina Divine, who Mother Divine, and then later on she died, and he married a young Canadian woman by the name of Edna Rose Richings, a white woman, young blonde, blue-haired, blue-eyed, and he actually kind of justified marrying her by saying that the Mother Divine had come back to life in her body. So that's the kind of people we're dealing with here. And so Jim Jones fell in love with Father Divine's message and brought it back to Indiana with him. He started talking about how celibacy was the way to go, how they should be chaste, and how they should not have children, but only adopt children. Even his mother got all over him about this. She said, you just went one step too far, Jimmy. This is not good. And Jimmy rebuked her, saying, I know what I'm doing. And he started really fostering a us versus them. He told them that his way, their way, was the best way. It was the way for complete social justice, complete equality, everyone taken care of, and the outside world was bad, and anybody against them was bad, and they should hate anybody that's against them. So he really started to foster a feeling of making outsiders the enemy, and this would become a running thing with the People's Temple. Also, a little bit of hypocrisy there. Marceline actually became pregnant during this whole celibacy, the start of this whole celibacy. So there was a lot of rumors around. And I've often wondered why Jones just didn't use it to his advantage and say it was an immaculate conception. But he didn't. He had to get up and admit, I don't practice what I preach. Late 1957, early 1958, Jones started calling his church family a communalism situation. It was based on Stalinistic communism, and Marxist communism, but it was really, he called it communalism, and he really started bringing in the idea that you should give all your worldly possessions to the church. Unfortunately, a lot of the Midwesterners in his congregation were staunch capitalists, and they weren't quite buying it. They might give a little bit more on Sunday, but they weren't convinced they should give the church everything. So it only partially worked. So he decided that the recent revolution in Cuba, we're talking where Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban government in the 50s, that perhaps that was a good place to look for new church members. So he actually went to Havana and actually started scouting for recent Cuban refugees to bring them back to the United States to make them members of this church, because they were already indoctrinated communists, so he figured they would be down with the complete surrender of all possessions to the church. So he made a couple of trips down to Miami and stuff looking, and later on he would go to Havana. Also in 1958, he decided they needed to expand their family. They needed to practice what they preached about adopting children, and they adopted a set of brother and sister from Korea. It was during the Korean War, so they brought in a couple of Korean refugee children. Their names were Stephanie and Lou Eric Jones, and Marcy was delighted. They were her pride and joy. She loved them. She loved Agnes. She doted on her children, but things with Jim kept getting worse and worse, and it would often break out into physicality. There's even a rumor that he once kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant. So, yeah. Later in 1958, Stephanie would be tragically killed. Little Stephanie would be tragically killed in a car accident returning home from a Cincinnati revival meeting. They were all driving in separate cars, and the driver of her car tried to pull out to pass a truck, didn't quite make it. Everybody in the car was killed, including Stephanie. And Jones would use this as everything he did was for showmanship. So he would use this as a way to show how clairvoyant he really was. He would say that he dreamed something happened to Stephanie. He had a premonition. Also, Marceline said that she had a dream that Stephanie came home that night and she put her to bed. And then when she woke up the next morning, she found out that her daughter was dead. So a little bit of weirdness there. While she was alive, Stephanie always talked about her friend 𝗂𝗍𝗂𝗊, and they actually made contact, wrote a letter to the orphanage in Korea where they had gotten Lou and Stephanie, and asked if there was a child there by the name of 𝗂𝗂𝗊𝗂𝗊. Turns out there was. It was a little girl, and the Koreans and the owners of the orphanage said yes, and her and Stephanie were always really good friends. So they actually wrote 𝗂𝗂𝗊𝗂𝗊𝗂𝗂𝗊 from Korea and adopted her in honor of their daughter Stephanie, and I thought that was a really nice thing. They changed her name to Susan. And also Marcy, later on in 1958, would give birth to their only natural child, Stephen Gandhi Jones. And not long after that, they adopted they were the first white family in the state of Indiana to adopt a black baby. They went to an orphanage, actually to adopt a white baby, and there was a little black boy there sitting that was crying, wouldn't stop crying. Jim and Marceline walked over to him. Marceline picked him up. He immediately stopped crying and started laughing. So they adopted him, and they actually named him Jim Jones Jr. And I often wondered what their natural son, Stephen, really thought of that. And we'll find out a little bit later. He didn't always take it as well as he should. And then later on, they would adopt yet another boy, a white boy from the church. Tim Tupper was his original last name. He was from a very dysfunctional family. They would later adopt him, and he would become Tim Jones. So now we have Agnes. Stephanie passed away, but we have Agnes, Lou, Susan, Jim Jr., Stephen, and Tim. So 6 children now, as well as a house full of strays from the church that Jim brings home to take care of them. And it was not long after the start of what they called their rainbow family. And he would use this rainbow family to his strength. He would parade them out, showing them how progressive they are. Look at my rainbow family. In fact, his own son, Jim Jones Jr., would later say that his father never did anything unless it was for show. That he loved his father, but he also hated him. So he used it for his benefit. It was never they just did it and went on with their life. They did it and put it on, the national scale for everybody to see. It was during this time, though, late 1958, that Jim also made his trip down to Havana, Cuba. He got a hotel room in Havana and started walking around kind of looking for black Cubans, his words, not mine, black Cubans, to kind of recruit to come back to the United States to help build the communalism, aka communism, of the People's Temple. And he actually met one by the name of Carlos Foster. He was a Cuban of Jamaican descent, and he actually offered him $24 a day to help Jim Jones find others. So he got about 15 or 20 names and started trying to convince these people to actually move back to the United States, back to Indianapolis, and join his church. Didn't really work out that well because he was pitching something that didn't exist. He told them that they had farms in Indianapolis. They could all come and live and work in the fields, and they would be fed and have all their needs taken care of. That kind of sounds a little bit like slavery to me, but what have you. But this was kind of a precursor to Jonestown, which you will find out was a form of slavery when we get into that. So this is what he was pitching, but nothing really existed. Nothing like this existed. He was telling a tall tale. And it turns out that only Carlos Foster would later come over, and he would basically keep the Cuban man prisoner in his own house and wouldn't let him go out, and had him do odd jobs around the church. And eventually Carlos got fed up with it, and all the time Jim Jones bragging about how he was helping this poor refugee and how wonderful Castro was, said he met Castro. He never met Castro. Said he met Castro and how wonderful everything was, and there was schools and hospitals, and how wonderful communism was for Cuba. We all know that's bullshit. And he kept Carlos prisoner in his home, basically. Let him go out to do odd jobs and come right back in. Eventually, Carlos ran away, went to New York, where he said he had a girlfriend, and never came back. Those communal farms never happened, at least not in the state of Indiana. 1959, Jim took another trip back to Philadelphia to visit a very ill Father Divine. He had a meeting with both Father and Mother Divine, aka the second wife, and he actually begged them to allow him to be the successor to Father Divine's empire. So he wanted Father Divine to name Jim his successor, basically say that when he died, he would come back in Jim Jones' body, as weird as that sounds. So Jim Jones would be in charge of not only Father Divine's congregation, but the People's Temple, and they could merge them. Mother Divine wasn't having it. She was named his heir, and she basically told him to amscray. So he went back to Indianapolis a little bit defeated. Finally, we get into 1960 and 1961. He met a young Disciples of Christ, which, as I had said earlier, was kind of an offshoot of the Church of Christ. A young minister within the Disciples of Christ by the name of Ross Case. And he actually convinced Jim to pursue a merger and ordination with the Disciples of Christ. It would bring more validity to the People's Temple and also make them eligible for tax benefits. They would become tax exempt if they were an actual recognized church. And so Jim said, only for that reason, Jim said he would. So he started kind of, you know, having interdenominational services with the Disciples of Christ. He would go to their churches. They would come to his. He developed a really good relationship, and the People's Temple was accepted into the Disciples of Christ. And so you actually see old flyers for the People's Temples. It said People's Temple of the Disciples of Christ. So he became an ordained Disciples of Christ minister, and the People's Temple were eventually absorbed by the Disciples of Christ in Indiana. And it was a good thing because it made them kind of homegrown. The Disciples of Christ started in Indiana, so it made them kind of Hoosier loyal, so to speak. So it did bring with them a whole lot of tax benefits. And Ross Case had some. Ross Case would later become one of the inner people at the People's Temple, but he had a lot of pull with the local government, and he actually introduced Jim Jones to Mayor Charles Baldwell, who was a conservative Democrat. These are old school. This is an old school Democrat. We're also going to meet some liberal Republicans later on in the story too. It's mind-boggling. But he had pledged $7,000 a year as a salary, which was a lot. Remember, this is 61. Was a lot for a municipal salary, but he had pledged $7,000 a year for a director of human rights position. It was a commission to make sure that human rights weren't being violated in the city of Indianapolis, because there was a push to kind of integrate a little bit. the mayor wanted to kind of be on the forefront, wanted to at least look like he was trying to do something about it. So Jim Jones was literally the only applicant for the position. I've got to remember, the KKK still had a huge stronghold in Indiana, especially Indianapolis. So, yeah, Jim Jones was literally the only applicant. And he was interviewed by a panel. There was a rabbi, a Catholic priest, and a Protestant minister in there. And he got along really well. He bumped heads a little bit with the Catholic priest because, as the Catholic priest said, he was sickeningly Protestant. But they did recommend Jim Jones for the job, and he got it at a salary of $7,000 a year. So he started using his power and his church members to help integrate the city of Indianapolis. So there was a couple of incidents where he would go up to a restaurant that had no one in it, like in the mid-afternoon, and ask for tables for 150 people. Of course, they wanted the money, so they would oblige him, and then he would filter in all these African Americans from his church, and the restaurant would flip out, but then he would say, "Oh, but I'm Jim Jones. I'm the director of human rights for the city. You'll be a very progressive business. These people will come back and patronize your business." And so the business was kind of stuck a little bit. And so he started forcibly integrating places. There was also another situation with a theater where he bought out an entire show and filtered a lot of African Americans into it. And the manager was screaming, "Our section for coloreds only holds 50. And he goes, "Well, now you manage the first integrated theater in Indianapolis, and I'm with the government." And so the owners were kind of like, "Okay, whatever." So, but the temple members were very good about being loyal. After these businesses allowed them in and it kind of laid down their guard, you would have the temple members actually come back and patronize these places. So it was a good thing for everybody. But there's that stubborn streak, I guess, that people don't want to be made to do anything. But still, I applaud Jim Jones for his effort, because segregation was a terrible thing. It really was. And I admire Jim Jones for what he did for the city of Indianapolis. If the story had ended here, there are so many points on this way. If the story ended, we would be reading good things about Jim Jones today. And if it had ended here, he would go down alongside Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. as a huge, Medgar Evers, as a huge fighter for civil rights. He really would. Mayor and the city council started asking him to back off just a little bit, but he didn't. He was on a roll. He started speaking at a lot of civil rights conferences. He got a lot of headlines in both the traditional and the African American newspapers. And he started getting publicity for both his church. A lot of people tuned in to listen to his radio show. A lot of more people started coming to the church. It swelled to way over 1,000 members. And he had a great inner circle. His associate pastors were doing great. He had brought in Ross Case, who was a traditional disciples of Christ, more mainstream. He was a storyteller. So all these ministers would take turns opening for Jim on Sunday mornings, and he really had a good rhythm. So you had Ross Case, who was a better storyteller, traditional disciples of Christ minister. 𝗟cie 𝗿𝗍𝒻, who was, Archie even admitted, "I'm the figurehead black." He was very much a boisterous, kind of a traditional black preacher, very loud, very rambunctious, but he actually wasn't a Christian. He admitted that many times. He was a Universalist. So you had a weird mix. You had a Christian congregation with an atheist, a Universalist, and just a mix of other pastors heading this church. It was just really weird. Then you had Russell Winberg, who came from Laurel Street Methodist, who was very Pentecostal in the way that he preached. And then you had Jack Beam, who was not a pastor at all, just a figurehead for the church, was just a boisterous kind of jokester. So you had a really good mix of people. But remember, the People's Temple was more of a social movement than it was a church. And we'll start to see them kind of drop the trappings of a church later on. But for right now, they had a good thing going. They had a good church going. Jim got along very well with all of his assistant pastors. They used to go to training together, hang out together. They talked a lot about sex, which was really weird. Jim would tell him that they would tell them they felt tempted by the women in the church, which would later become a very destructive pattern for Jim Jones. And they would talk about how they dealt with the temptation. And even one of them, even Russell Winberg, admitted that he felt dirty even after having sex with his wife. And it was just very weird, the conversations they would have. But they did build a camaraderie. They became closer than brothers. And for a long time, everything was good. You had a lot more members that were giving a lot more money to the church. And you had them feeding the hungry and helping the elderly and getting people medical care that they needed. And you had him walking around helping to integrate the city of Indianapolis. So you had a lot of good things going on in the 1961 temple. Then we get into 1962 and 1963, and things start to go downhill a little bit, or start going downhill a little bit. You had Jim Jones kind of putting his efforts less toward integration and more to stopping white flight. He would go around to neighborhoods that were starting to go downhill and try to convince the whites almost by force not to sell their homes and move out. So you had him trying to kind of bully people to stay in certain neighborhoods so that the property values wouldn't go down. It was very weird, but you had him out there trying to do that. Then he started running into issues with KKK and local hate groups. They graffitied the People's Temple a couple of times. Also, there was an incident where a car almost blew up. There were hate letters, dead cats. There was a dead cat that was thrown into the window of the Jones home. Dynamite went off one time outside the Jones house. But Russell Winberg and Marcelin actually started wondering whether or not Jim didn't stage some of it. Because they were at a church social one time where Russell Winberg had both made and served Jim his plate. And in the middle of it, Jim jumped up and showed them glass in his food, saying, "Someone just tried to kill me." And Russell Winberg knew with a certainty there was no glass in that food. So they began to think that Jim was staging a lot of the hate calls and a lot of the graffiti, even maybe the dead cat, to kind of show that they were having some trouble so that he could, I don't know, start a paranoia within the church. Paranoia was becoming a problem because he was using a lot of barbiturates, injectable barbiturates, downers for sleep. He was also using amphetamines during the day, uppers, to keep him going. And he started getting very paranoid, not sleeping well. And Marcelin would always tell the kids, "Don't worry, these are just B12 shots." So yeah, he continued to push more communalism. He wanted more and more from the church. And Beam, who, like I said, his day job was a maintenance man for a pharmaceutical company. 𝐼EMS was an old school capitalist too. They weren't having it. They all pushed back. They still had about half the congregation pushing back about giving all their possessions to the church. And so there started to be a rift between the band of brothers. Very few of them gave up their possessions, and very few in the church gave up the possessions. They might give 20 or 30% of their paychecks on Sunday, but no one was giving up their possessions. It continued to just be the elderly without family that would give all their possessions to the church. Jim started being sort of a hypochondriac. He faked a seizure one time. He faked a heart attack. He actually, after the heart attack, was actually taken to one of the local hospitals. He had a black doctor. He made a big show of having a black doctor, and he was actually taken to one of the local hospitals. And because he had a black doctor, no one had actually looked at his chart to see that he was a Caucasian. They actually put him in a black ward because they had a black doctor. They assumed he was a black man. I don't understand how these people didn't know who Jim Jones was, but still. And so, as a result, they were trying to move him to the white wing of the hospital, and he basically got up and started bathing and changing the bedpans of the black patients around him. A little weird, but still a nice thing to do. And as a result, the hospital felt so guilty because here was not only a civil servant, but a well-known minister in the city, and they've treated him like this. So they actually integrated the hospital after that point. So there was another good thing he did, though in a very weird way. Then he had a vision of the apocalypse, he said, while in the hospital. He said he had a vision. Remember, we are in the throes of the Cold War now. he had a vision of a nuclear apocalypse that was coming, and he knew that Indiana was not safe, so he was going to look for a place to go that would be safe in the event of a nuclear holocaust. And there was actually an Esquire article that came out that listed 7 of the safest places in the world to be a nuclear war. There was only one American place in there, and that was Ukiah, California, but it did list a lot of South American countries. So Jim decided to visit some of them. One of them was Guyana, which he would later on go to. Brazil was another, and Hawaii, interestingly enough. Remember, Hawaii only became a state in the 50s, so it was still very foreign to most Americans. So he did go down and visit Ghana briefly. Didn't really appeal to him. He briefly visited Brazil, but then went to Hawaii, and he really liked Hawaii. He actually brought his entire family over, mother-in-law, father-in-law, mother, everyone, and they stayed a few months there on the church's dime, leaving Russell Winberg in charge of the People's Temple. And they stayed in Hawaii a few months, but Jim decided it was just too expensive for the People's Temple, so he was sold on Brazil, because Brazil was it was a socialistic type of government, and it was also very inexpensive to live there. So he decided that he wanted to try to start a People's Temple mission in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, and eventually move the entire church there because they would be safe in the case of a nuclear holocaust. He took his family and went over to Belo Horizonte, Brazil. And there he met a young Assemblies of God missionary by the name of Edward Mallman and his wife, Judy. They started communing very heavily with the Mallmans, and he actually developed, Marceline did, a very good relationship with their oldest daughter, Bonnie, who was starting to have some friction with her parents, as teenagers do. And she became kind of a confidant for Marceline. They would, hang out, go shopping, they would dance, they had a really good time. And so Bonnie actually moved in with the Jones to kind of be a nanny to their younger children while they were there. And all the time as Jim is out communing with Edward Mallman, trying to find a place, suitable property for the People's Temple to purchase in Brazil, and Mallman was helping him because Mallman ran a very large Assemblies of Christ mission center there, and he started kind of integrating them with the Brazilian culture, teaching them Portuguese, all this stuff. And so Marcy, each night that she cooked dinner for the kids, she would also cook enough and feed a lot of the people in the neighborhood. So Bonnie really fell in love with the way they were doing things. And she really began idolizing Marcy and Jim. Brazil had been kind of a socialistic country, but now it was taking a hard swing left toward more Castro-like communism, and Jim really loved this. He thought, this is perfect. I get people here. They have no choice but to live the way I want them to live. Jim and Pastor Mallman would spend a lot of time together, and Jim would kind of question him to see where his ideology lies, and it was very much traditional Pentecostalism. Assemblies of God is a Pentecostal or holiness religion. And it was very much traditional Pentecostal. He was very grounded in the Bible. He was very grounded in the idea of God and the Trinity and all those things. And Jones would float his atheism and his spiritualism and everything. And Mallman would shoot him down. He wouldn't have any part of it. So Jim really realized there was no use in, trying to convince Mallman any differently, because he didn't believe that way. And he tried to bring Jones back to the Bible, but Jones had never really been with the Bible. He just kind of used it as a tool to forward a communist agenda. And Jim thought he needed some backup. So he called back up to Indianapolis and actually convinced Jack Beam and his family to come down to kind of help speed things along. And he actually told Jack to fake his passport application if he had to get down there. But the Beams actually did get there. And together they both started to work on Mallman to try to bring him into the fold. One thing Jim did realize, that Mallman was brilliant in running a business. He ran the mission that was there on a thin penny, and so he realized maybe he could be the one to help get the People's Temple finances in order because it was getting too much for Jim. Also, 𝗏 told him upon arrival that things were getting bad in Indianapolis. They were really, most of the People's Temple was really upset that so much of the money was being filtered down to Brazil for the Jones family to live on and to look for properties and things like that in Brazil, and that not enough of it was being used there in Indianapolis also. But Russell Winberg, who Jim Jones had left in charge, was actually turning the church into a traditional Pentecostal church. So it was going back to the Bible. There had been a swing away from the communalism because most Christians are capitalist, traditional Christians. So it was taking more of a capitalistic swing, and people were going back to just tithing 10% instead of giving more. So everything was starting to fall into disrepair, and as a result, the church was having difficulty paying its bills. They were getting collection letters. They had to do cash on delivery for the food they used to feed the poor. So he told him just how bad it was getting because Weinberg was taking it back to a traditional church. Jack Beam and he kind of discussed the atmosphere in Brazil and realized with the Assemblies of God already having such a hold there in the missionary world, as well as the use, a lot of the people there being of a voodoo type religion, that there was no part for them. But Jim did go out and study that voodoo type religion and learn some tricks from it. Tricks to make people, tricks to make people believe that he had more power than he did. So he did study it and brought some of that voodoo culture into his own mixed theology. But he also learned that Assemblies of God owned the area, and there was no hope for them in Belo Horizonte. They had to go elsewhere in Brazil if they really wanted to have a chance at starting their own mission. So he actually picked up his family, and they moved to Rio de Janeiro for a while, and with the hopes of starting a mission there, a People's Temple mission there. Bonnie Malman actually went with them. She was planning on staying with them until she started Bible college in Minnesota in the fall. While in Rio, they started an orphanage. They started an outreach for the poor, and rumors abided that Jim actually started sleeping with some of the politicians and diplomats' wives in Rio to get donations for his center. Now, no one knows if this is actually true or if this is just a rumor that Jim Jones started, but supposedly he, with the agreement of Marcelin, would have sex with diplomats' wives to get more money for their orphanage and their outreach in Rio. Also there, his mental illness started to take a turn for the worst. Finances were so bad for the church that they couldn't send money there to them as they had in the past. So things were just getting pretty dire. Again, he did learn from the voodoo religions of the area some more trickery. He also learned that started learning that the ends justify the means, that anything is okay as long as the outcome is good or what you want. So that would actually dictate a lot of his policy later on. Malman tried to counsel him from a distance, but they discovered Jim didn't really want to listen. So one day Edward Malman called him up and actually said, hey, we're going back to the USA for a while. We want to get Bonnie enrolled in her college and stuff. But Jones actually then convinced them, after they dropped Bonnie off in Minneapolis, could they please come to Indianapolis and help him get the church back on track. He really thought that Malman could help him financially get the church back on track. So Malman felt bad for him, so he said sure. So they took Bonnie up, got her enrolled in college, and then came down to Indianapolis to help Jim get the People's Temple financially back on track. Malman actually arrived in Indianapolis before Jim Jones. They were coming up from Rio, and they actually got there earlier. Well, Russell Weinberg had no idea they were coming, didn't know who he was, and he kind of felt abashed. So there was a lot of infighting now at the church. You had all the other associate pastors kind of against Weinberg, but then you had Malman coming in, and no one knew who was in charge, and there was a lot of infighting. And as a result, Weinberg left the church and took about half the parishioners with him to another church. And when Jim returned, you had about half the temple still there. Also had a lot of collection notices. They had literally been in Brazil 2 years, so he basically deserted the temple during this time, and it fell apart. So 𝗏𝗡 kind of helped him financially get back to where they could pay their bills on the income, got everything back on track. But there was still a lot of things to be repaired around the church. And one morning, Jim and 𝗏𝗡 went up to the roof of the church to patch a hole. And while he was up there, 𝗏𝗡 had a vision. He had a vision of Jim Jones actually pushing him off that roof to his death. And he said it just felt like evil had settled over him. So it wasn't long after that 𝗏𝗡 left and went back to Minnesota. And Jim Jones was left in charge of his own church again. Later on, Edward 𝗏𝗡 would say that he had psychological training as part of his seminary, and he saw homicidal tendencies in Jones. He saw jealousy and the need to get rid of anybody he saw in his way, and he really felt that Jones saw him as a threat because he had helped get the church back on a good financial track, and a lot of the members had a lot of respect for him, as well as the other associate pastors had a lot of respect for him, and he thought Jim saw him as a threat to his throne, and that's why he left. Also, you had some trouble here between 𝗟cie𝗹𝗿𝗁 and the rest of the People's Temple. 𝗟cie𝗹𝗿𝗁 and his wife had been caring for a young single mother who was white in the church for a long time. They had taken her into their home. They had cared for her and her baby. They had just been parents to her. She didn't really have a family to speak of, and they wanted to legally adopt her. And 𝗪𝗓 thought that the People's Temple would be wonderful with this, because if he was encouraging white families to adopt black children, why not black families adopt white children? Well, it wasn't like that at all. The church commission met. They basically, with the exception of Jack Beam, everyone else was against it. They told him it was terrible. They even started rumors that he had slept with this young lady, and that's why they wanted to adopt him. Just weird stuff. Made no sense at all. And 𝗪𝗓 from that time said that his faith in the temple dropped. His faith in what they were really, because remember, he was a Universalist. He wasn't a Christian, so he had no religious bindings. The only thing binding him to the temple was their social agenda, which he thought was absolute equality, ignoring the color of one's skin, and this taught him that it wasn't like that, and he lost a lot of faith with the temple. He didn't leave just yet. He would eventually, but not yet. In the meantime, the only thing now making money for the temple is still the nursing homes. And with all this uproar in the city of Indianapolis, the KKK started coming back, all the threats started. Now with his church dwindled now to now just about 150, Jim Jones decided it was time to get out of Indiana. And he looked back to that Esquire article and discovered Northern California, Eureka, California, was on that list. And he actually sent James Beam out to California to scout for an appropriate place to move the church to California. And that's where we will stop with the end of the People's Temple in Indiana. Next time we will come back. We will start the People's Temple in California and then later on in Guyana. So hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. Please like, comment, share, subscribe if you'd like to financially support the channel. I definitely appreciate it. Always appreciated, never required. Those links are down below. Thanks a lot, guys. Really appreciate it. I'll be back soon. 𝗙𝗏𝗀𝐽.